Hey, my name is Nick, and this video is going to serve as an in-depth guide on how to play Esper Goryos in the current modern metagame. So I have a ballpark of around 250 matches in the past 2 months or so. I did a lot of prep for RC Houston online, where I had around a 58% win rate with the deck leading up to the event. My performance on the weekend included a 16-6 match result performance, including a win in a last chance qualifier to get a qualification for Vegas, and a win on Sunday in the Super Reseq to get a qualification for the next month's standard RC cycle. Preparing for Vegas, I had around a 67% win rate online with the deck, and in Vegas, my performance in the main event was 11, 3, and 1, meaning I finished in 36th place, tied as one of the top 4 performing Goryos pilots in the entire event, and receiving an invite to the upcoming Pro Tour for Lorwyn Eclipsed. So hopefully this will give you confidence in trusting my judgment and my prep to advise you guys in how to play this deck if you're interested in playing it in locals or in higher level competition. So real quick, I just want to break down what this video is going to be and what it is not going to be. So this video is not going to be a card by card walkthrough of the deck. I do have my list on the screen and the link is going to be in the description below. So if you don't know what any of these cards do, I would recommend reading through them on your own first, pausing and coming back to this video. This video is not going to be a full in-depth tournament report of my Vegas performance, but if you're interested in that, I'll also have a link in the description of this video if you want to see a walkthrough of all of the matches I played during that event. This video is also not going to be a detailed one-for-one card-by-card sideboard guide for this deck, but if you're interested in that, and if I'm feeling generous, I might include a link to that in the description of the video as well. What this video will go over is a review of the 3 primary game plans that you'll be looking to deploy from this deck, the individual card selection that I have made in recent iterations of this deck list, and some of the associated play patterns that go into all the specific cards in this deck. And it'll also be a guide as to the texture of each matchup, how you're supposed to play and approach each matchup and what your overall game plans should be. So let's jump right in and talk about the primary game plans of Goryos, because plan A of this deck, which is what this deck is named after, is doing the Goryos Vengeance thing where you're reanimating Atraxa. A lot of the times your hands are going to contain, ideally, all 3 of a looting spell, a big thing to reanimate, and a Goryos Vengeance to reanimate something. But even if your hand contains just 2 of these 3 components, those are typically going to be keepable hands, assuming that your mana is cooperative to cast the spells that you have in your hand. 2 out of 3 of these is usually enough because you'll be able to churn through your deck to find the 3rd piece. So if you have a looting effect or a frog along with an Atraxa, you'll usually be able to see enough cards over the course of the game to get a Goryos, or vice versa. If you have the Goryos but not the Atraxa, then you can usually churn through enough cards to get to it. Now, sometimes you might have both the Atraxa or Griselbrand in your hand along with something like a Goryos Vengeance, but you won't have the way to put it into the graveyard. But that's okay, because there's actually 8 really effective ways in the deck to put one in your graveyard, and even though you're missing the way that's going to churn you into the missing component, you actually just have more natural draws for that missing component anyways, and then on top of your surveils, you're very likely to run into one of those ways. What I would not recommend doing with this deck, which I have tested multiple times, is thought seizing yourself on the first turn to take your large threat out of your hand. There's so much game 1 interaction in this format that decks have access to that this isn't a realistic game plan. You usually need thought seize to thought seize your opponent, because otherwise you'll either get thought seized yourself, or your opponent will have Thraben Charm to eat the big creature out of your graveyard. Your opponent will have K-Command to clean up your creature. There's too many main board ways for your opponent to interact with this game plan that using a premium resource like that, taking a second card out of your own hand and exposing what your game plan is to your opponent, is just too risky to be reliable. So I would say don't think about Thoughtseize as a way to take your own threat unless you're much later in the game where you've ripped apart what your opponent's doing and you need that to finish the job. Once you resolve your Atraxa or Griselbrand, usually you'll be able to attack with it. You'll be able to get a huge card advantage based on the trigger or the Griselbrand activation, and you'll be able to ephemerate to keep it in play. What's so valuable about Goryos is it's an instant, so that oftentimes you're going to be winding up casting this on your opponent's end step to put additional pressure on them, make it harder for them to play around. Maybe you have a force of negation to back it up. And even if it fails, you could even sometimes try again on your turn or enact an alternative game plan if that one fails. Now, one of the most common misconceptions I get about this deck is, well, if you're not able to consistently do the Goryos thing every game, then why are you playing this deck over something like Esper midrange? Or this deck has a midrange game plan, but if that's the game plan you're doing, then you're not going to win your matchup because you're just worse at that than other midrange decks, this and that. But what I'm going to say is, and I'm just going to throw some numbers out there. It's kind of approximations, but I'm only usually winning with a Goryos reanimation game plan, that plan A, maybe like 40% of my matches. And I'd say another 40-ish% of my matches is going to be this plan B that we're going to talk about, which is a plan we didn't have access to before this new card Quantum Riddler came out in Edge of Eternities. Riddler adds an entirely new dimension to this deck that also introduces an entirely new game plan that I would honestly say is just as effective and harder to interact with as the Goryos game plan, because Quantum Riddler in conjunction with Psychic Frog can do some messed up things. When you play a Frog on turn 2 and a Riddler on turn 3, you can manage the size of your hand to always guarantee you're going to draw 2 cards with the Riddler. And then if you can use that third land drop and mana to ephemerate the Riddler and keep it in play, well, you're going to draw even more cards. You're going to have 2 huge creatures in play. You're going to have a fast clock with an evasive flying frog. The next turn, you have the optionality of either re-ephemerating your Riddler to cycle through and churn through even more cards of your deck, or if you just want to apply more pressure, you can just start attacking with your 2 big flyers in the air. And churning through your deck in such a proficient manner is going to actually just let you stumble into the plan A, the reanimated Atraxa game plan, a lot more frequently. And you're going to find that within a couple turns, you'll be able to assemble that combo. And now you have 2 problematic game plans, both of which your opponent has to deal with. I would actually say the Frog Riddler combo is honestly very potent and also just easier to set up because it really only requires 2 cards. The true combo really comes when you can ephemerate the Riddler, but that's not always necessary, as Riddler by itself will often draw you 2 cards the turn you play it after deploying a Frog. And then when the Frog attacks, you'll get to draw at the very least another 2 cards again by discarding things. And when you're in the process of drawing an extra 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, sometimes you won't even have to discard. Sometimes you'll be able to use those extra cards to hit your land drop, or you'll be able to use Solitude, pitching a white card to empty your hand back out again, and then continue drawing more cards. You're going to have a lot of opportunities where you're going to have multiple draw triggers in the stack, multiple triggers of Riddler, and in between these individual triggers, you can manage your hand size with Frog or deploy the resources to just get the maximum amount of value possible out of the Quantum Riddler. I've won games against Amulet where I went turn 1 Prismatic, ending your Amulet, turn 2 play a Frog, turn 3 Quantum Riddler ephemerate, loot through a bunch of my deck, give my Frog evasion, swing in for damage. The next turn, draw a bunch of extra cards with Quantum Riddler, maybe warp in another Riddler, and then I would attack for like 14 damage on turn 4. And get in for lethal the turn before they were able to combo off. You can actually get some really fast kills with the Frog and Riddler conjunction in this deck, and it is a real game plan that I'm telling you I am winning with in this deck just as frequently as I'm winning with the Atraxa game plan. And then we have plan C. So plan A is reanimated Atraxa, plan B, Frog Riddler, and plan C is more of a fair, grindy game plan that you can enable in some of these longer matchups where you're playing the control role because you have so much interaction in your deck, which we'll get into in a second, that facilitates you to be able to just play these fair Quantum Riddlers on turn 5, hardcast these fair Solitudes on turn 5, and even deploy fair Atraxas on turn 7 for 7 mana. This will come up often against a lot of the Riddler mirror matches or against any other grindy mid-range deck, and it even will come up against matchups that you wouldn't think it would, like other combo decks or things like Brood Scale or even Boros Energy decks where you're playing the control role, you're extinguishing your resources early, and now you're just playing this very fair plan with fair creatures. You're playing around Graveyard Hate and you're trying to extract as much value out of your creatures as possible. So those are the 3 game plans of the deck, and I kind of can't really tell you how to determine which one is correct, other than you have to look at the texture of your hand and what matchup you're playing against and figure out how your hand can use these different game plans independently and together to win each individual game that you're playing. And this is just going to take a lot of reps with the deck to learn how to use those different game plans. Some of the other cards we haven't talked about yet, we do have 5 total big creatures to reanimate between Atraxa and Griselbrand. Griselbrand notably more useful in a lot of these against a lot of these decks that have mainboard consign, like Jeskai Blink, because they can't consign the Griselbrand because there's no trigger, while they can consign the Atraxa. Atraxa otherwise usually pretty much better in every other way. Griselbrand a little bit better at turn 3 killing with a Psychic Frog, but Atraxa overall, the fact that you don't have to pay the life, the fact that you can actually see more cards without activating, that it has Vigilance, that there's a lot of pros to having in Atraxa versus the Griselbrand. It also pitches to both of your free pitch spells. Speaking of, Solitude and Force of Negation, both very powerful spells in this deck that give it a lot of game against early aggression and early combo potential from specific decks. These cards got even stronger in the newer iterations of this deck since the printing of the card Quantum Riddler, because you can freely expend resources and recoup the value so easily with this card, or with reanimating an Atraxa, of course. You have so many ways to generate card advantage when you're low resources with this deck that you're not really punished for using all these pitch spells. And I'd argue that this is one of the best decks at facilitating all of these free pitches. Ephemerate is going to be very useful at scamming your Quantum Riddlers into play on turn 3, but it's also very important at making sure your Atraxas stick around. You typically don't want to reanimate an Atraxa on turn 2, even if you have the ability to do so, because you can't keep it in play without the 3rd mana to ephemerate it. Sometimes you won't have a choice and you should go for it. Usually, however, it's best to do it maybe during your opponent's end step, assuming that you don't think they have any interaction for you, and then having the option to keep it around the following turn. The split between Prismatic Ending and March of Otherworldly Light is very deliberate. March of Otherworldly Light has been an MVP for me, specifically because it hits the card Urza's Saga for 1 mana and is killer against decks like Affinity and Amulet Titan. Whereas Prismatic Ending is going to be better at hitting things like a turn 1 Ragavan or a turn 1 Expedition map or Amulet of Vigor. So they both have their pros and cons. They're both very flexible. Notably, you can overpitch to March to intentionally empty your hand so that you can make your Riddlers a little more powerful. That hasn't really come up for me too much, but it is something you have the option to do. And March can also hit much larger things. It's easier for a March to hit something like a Goblin Charbelcher, whereas Prismatic, you really need to get all 4 of your types in play, which can be a little more challenging to do. March is also one of your only answers to the card Elishnorn, Mother of Machines, and you can very realistically clean it up with this card. The 2 Thoughtseize are really good against combo decks and good against other decks that are trying to interact with you, good against control and stuff like that. We have a split between 3 Faithful Mending and 1 Tainted Indulgence. This was a bit of technology that some people at the previous Pro Tour came up with, and the Tainted Indulgence is a smidge better in those longer, grindier matchups. I'm often boarding out 1 copy of this effect in most matches, so you can just board out the version that is less good in the specific matchups. So against the more aggressive decks, you can board out the Indulgence, since the life actually is pretty big game, and this card pitches to Solitude, which is more important in those matchups. But in the longer, grindier matches, you can board out your copy of Mending instead. So then we have the mana, which for the most part is pretty stock. I'll talk about some of the couple slight variations I have in my list, but I'm playing the 3 basic lands, as everyone is, the 3 shock lands, and I'm playing the 4th Surveil. I'm still a big fan of the Hedge Maze over the Breeding Pool. People are pretty split between the 2. And what's great about Goryos, it's a very modular, a very customizable type of deck. So you can build it in a way that suits your playstyle and suits the meta that you expect in your local event. So having the untapped Breeding Pool will come up sometimes. You'll want that extra land to come into play untapped when you draw it naturally. You'll sometimes want to have the green when you fetch it up on like turn 7 to play your Atraxa right away. I've personally found more value in having the extra Surveil, especially because sometimes you're milling a Surveil land over in the process of digging for things. And in the long games, that extra look is just so valuable. So I'm still a big fan of having the Hedge Maze in the deck. And I'm playing this weird card that you guys are probably like, why is there a Suppression Ray in this guy's deck? I tried playing a list with 21 lands with an extra Flooded Strand, and that's totally reasonable if that's what you want to do. I also tried playing a list with Sink into Stupor, which was some technology people had initially, but I wasn't really a fan of that because 90% of the time I was playing it as a land. You'd still play it tapped a lot of the time. It was just a basic blue source. It felt kind of like a bad island a lot of the time, and it only pitches to force. Notably, Suppression Ray is basically a land that pitches to both of your free spells, Solitude and Force, and critically, it is a sorcery typing that you can take off of Atraxa, which gives you oftentimes an additional card type you can pull from. Oftentimes I was finding myself in situations where with Atraxa where I was taking Solitude as my creature, and then I wanted Force as my instant, and okay, now I just get a land, and I don't have any pitchables for maybe one or the other that I need. And Suppression Ray kind of fills in this gap where it's like, if you get both those, now I don't have to give up one of them to take the corresponding color card from the other card type. I don't have to give up the Solitude to take a Rizzler to pitch the Force. I don't have to give up the Force to take an Ephem to pitch the Solitude. I can just take the Suppression Ray that can pitch to either of them. So yes, sometimes your mulligans are going to get punished when you open a hand that has Suppression Ray and Basic Island, and you would have wished it was a Flooded Strand because you could have kept that hand, and now you can't. That's going to happen, but this card's going to come up more so in those long matches, and you're getting more triggers with Atraxa, and maybe you draw an extra land and you don't want it. Now you actually have a useful pitchable card with one of your spells. And now you have this 11th real land in your deck, because sometimes in those long grindy games you're milling some of your lands. You don't have a lot of real lands. There's only 10 actual factual lands in your deck that produce mana. This is just another piece of cardboard that you can put into play to keep hitting your land drops as the game goes along, because trust me, you will want to hit your land drops with this deck every single turn since you have so much to do with your mana. So this is something I'd play, but I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to go with a more stock mana base. And the other unique card I'm playing here is Superior Spider-Man that some people have been testing around with. Initially in Houston, I was playing the card Emperor of Bones in the sideboard because I tried this card and wasn't as happy with it, really mostly because I didn't like that it got blown out by Mystical Dispute. Spending 4 mana on a card that can get blown out by a card at 1 mana, and it also gets blown out by stuff like Strict Serenade, is a little bit annoying. But I'm starting to realize, or I was starting to realize more recently after playing with the card again, that I actually think this card is better than Emperor of Bones. Emperor of Bones was nice at the time to also manage graveyards. It was a cheap threat you could put into play pretty early, another reanimation thing, and I did really want the 5th reanimation spell in the main deck. But Superior Spider-Man is just such a flexible and strong card. It's such a powerful effect, and I want you to read this card in extra time because it does a lot of different things even though it's just one line of text. Superior Spider-Man is a reanimation spell. It's a 5th Goryos, but it also plays a little bit better around graveyard interaction, right? If you have multiple things to reanimate, you don't have to choose what you're reanimating until it enters. So if you have both a Grizzlebrand and an Atraxa in your graveyard and your opponent has Surgical, they kind of have to pick which one they want to play around less, and both of those are probably going to win you the game if they resolve. Superior Spider-Man also stays in play, so if you reanimate if you make it a copy of Atraxa, it is smaller. It's a 4/4, but you don't have to blink it, so you can have more flexibility with a card you take. You don't have to use Ephemerate as your slot for an instant and get blown out by maybe an opposing Solitude. Superior Spider-Man also keeps its card name, so you can have multiple copies of Atraxa in play if you reanimate one and later on copy one with Superior Spider-Man, or vice versa. Superior Spider-Man also doesn't need to copy just legendary creatures. I very frequently am casting this card and exiling a Solitude out of my own graveyard, eating one of my opponent's creatures, and now I have a 4/4 lifelinker that's starting to beat in and present a very fast clock. You can also use Superior Spider-Man as graveyard hate for your opponent. In the mirror match, you cast it, you exile your opponent's Atraxa, and now they no longer have a threat to reanimate, and you do. Superior Spider-Man is also a creature you can bring back with your Goryos because it is legendary. So not only is it a 5th reanimation effect, it's also a 6th reanimation target. I did used to have Ketramos in the deck as the 6th reanimation target, but was a little bit disappointed at the performance of it when I was playing it. But Superior Spider-Man is now filling that role, and it's really strong also as a Goryos target. And because you're playing the card Goryos Vengeance and Ephemerate, both of which are instants, you can also use Superior Spider-Man as opposing graveyard hate. If your opponent tries to Goryos Vengeance their own target in their graveyard, you can Goryos your own Superior Spider-Man, flash it into play, eat that card, get it, and they also don't get it. Or if your Superior Spider-Man's already on the battlefield, you can Ephemerate it, phase it out, phase it back in, copy something new, and then reuse the effect again. This card is very flexible and has a lot of tricks involved in it. There's a lot of depth to this card. It's a lot more than what it looks like. And although it's not anything broken, it's just a solid card that fills out a slot in this deck that I was looking for when I was putting the pieces together. So I would recommend giving this card a shot and seeing how it performs for you. I've notably also used the card to copy Quantum Riddlers. I copied a Sire of 7 Deaths. Sometimes there are just some really sweet things from your opponent's graveyard that you can take to make even more effective use of this card. Let's run through the sideboard quick and then talk about some of these specific matchup textures. So we have 4 Consigned to Memory, which is pretty stock against all of the Kozilek's command decks, and you'll play it against some of the other combo decks, such as Belcher. Fatal Push was a card I added because I wanted another answer really to stuff like Doorkeeper Thrall and Felia. It's very efficient at answering stuff like that. It's efficient at answering stuff like Orcish Bowmasters, a lot of these 2-mana creatures that people are flashing in, and it's another really good answer for Ragavan. March of Otherworldly Light was a last-minute swap I made to this list an hour before registering it for Vegas. I was playing a Celestial Purge, and my buddy Joe DeJoy, who actually, funnily enough, his deck is right here on the screen as one of the top performing decks in the Super Sunday RCQ for Goryos, kind of told me that March is just a more flexible Celestial Purge, and I was like, yeah, why didn't I think of that earlier? I mean, Purge is better mana efficiently wise. It's specifically dealing with Blood Moon, which is the reason I was playing this card initially. But this also just deals with other problematic stuff like Urza's Saga, which was massive for this tournament. Stuff like Elishnorn, Mother of Machines, which is otherwise unbeatable. Having another answer for that is huge. Even something as simple as a Ragavan or just another early threat. This card has just been really, really awesome for me overall, so I'm happy I played the second copy. We have 2 pieces of graveyard interaction for the Goryos Vengeance Mirror, or for anything else that cares about specific stuff in their graveyard. You can bring in Nihil Spellbomb against stuff like Storm or Flage decks. You can bring in stuff like Surgical Extraction for something more graveyard-oriented like Cat Combo, or even an Esper Blink. I'll bring this in to eat all their Solitudes, which is like their only answer for your creatures. An extra Thoughtseize is really good against all the Riddler mirrors and against the combo and control decks. Wrath of the Skies is very good against Boros, very good against Affinity, very good against Is It Prowess. I also bring in this card against Amulet Titan because it does clean up Urza's Saga, as well as against Broodscale. Mystical Dispute for the blue decks, and Teferi Time Raveler is good against the Mirror, against Jeskai Blank, against stuff that wants to cast counter spells like Simic Ritual. I was playing 0 copies of this card at Houston, which might have been a mistake. Both my teammate and I who played this deck kind of agreed that we didn't need it at the time. And I'm not sure if I say I missed it necessarily, but it definitely would have been nice to have had it. And then the one card I forgot to mention was Pest Control. I should have brought this up. Pest Control is the other flex slot I decided to fill in the main deck. This card actually was initially a toss-up between one of like 5 different cards. It was the 60th card in my deck. I was at this point pretty committed to cards like Superior Spider-Man and all the other spells in the deck. But the 5th and final card was either going to be a Teferi Time Raveler, a Thoughtseize, a Fatal Push, one of the first Consigned to Memory, or Pest Control. And I picked Pest Control because we had evaluated that the meta for this event was going to be very heavy on Boros, Is It Affinity, Amulet Titan, Is It Prowess, and then there might be some other lingering decks that this card is serviceable against, like the Broodscale combo deck. And those 5 decks combined, I think, made up over 40% of the meta. Now, that's not to say Teferi wouldn't have performed in this tournament for me, because I did play against some decks where it would have been really nice to have. Notably, I played Jeskai Blank twice. I played Simic Ritual twice. But I also played against decks like Is It Prowess twice. I ran into Boros Energy. I played against Affinity. I played against a lot of these decks where Pest Control was massive. And I think there were 2 different matches where I got to use the Pest Control in game 1, and it was pretty huge. Based on the meta for the weekend, I was very happy with my selection there. But this is an example of something where you need to kind of configure this deck based on what you're playing against, based on what you expect as the meta evolves over time. There might be a meta that exists where both Tefs should be in the main deck, or there might be a meta where something like Eldrazi becomes really big, where you do want the first Consigned to Memory in the main deck, which was the case when I was playing in Houston, whereas now that's a much smaller percentage of the meta share. Or maybe it gets even more aggro dominated and you want to move a copy of either Push or March into the main board to supplement your other removal. So these are answers I can't tell you, but they're questions you can ask yourself and figure out as you decide what cards you want to register here. So the last thing I want to talk about in this video is sort of the matchup spread and the texture of the different matchups, at least for the top 5 or 10 top decks in the metagame, what you should be thinking about in those matchups, how to play them. Before I get into that, if you got any value at all out of this video, I'd really appreciate if you consider subscribing. I do plan on making more videos moving forward on the decks I'm playing going into Standard and into Modern in the future for upcoming Pro Tours and the such. So definitely subscribe, hit that follow button, and let me know in the comments if you have other questions related to this deck. So we had predicted that the top 3 decks of the event were going to be Jeskai Blink, Boros Energy, and Amulet Titan. We were pretty spot on with this prediction. Jeskai Blink is also another Quantum Riddler Solitude pile and is also going to just play this kind of mid-rangey plan similar to how Goryos is, but Goryos has this hidden combo package that just kind of wins the game at any given time if you can effectively deploy it. So I had a lot of matches against Jeskai where we'd be doing the mid-range thing. They're a little bit better at doing the mid-range thing. They would creep ahead of me a little bit in terms of value, but then as soon as I do the Goryos thing, I will just kind of win out of nowhere. And that's what happened in a couple of my games against Jeskai. The other thing about Jeskai is now they, especially post-sideboard, they really have to respect your graveyard plan. They have to plan more around it, and they can't always commit everything. They can't always tap out. They can't necessarily keep in all of their mid-range plan pieces. And because of that, you can go a little bit less on the graveyard plan post-board and play more of this grindy mid-range plan with just this secret graveyard combo kill that you can surprise them with out of nowhere. Winning this matchup often involves dealing with their early Ragavan and Felia. If you can't deal with the Felia, you at the very least need to be able to deal with the things they are getting value out of with Felia, because a lone Felia doesn't do much by itself. In fact, I played an awesome match against Nathan Stoyer where a lot of times I was thought seizing him and he was having 2 Felias in hand, and I couldn't deal with both of them. So I just had to deal with the pieces that supported Felia, and Felia doesn't do as much when it's a standalone threat. Against Jeskai Blink, you're oftentimes hard casting Atraxa later in the game. Teferi Time Raveler is one of the best cards you can have against them. Your Mystical Disputes are very powerful and valuable post-board, and you just always have to make sure you can threaten that graveyard plan even if you don't necessarily have it. I'd say this is about a 50-50 matchup. And honestly, I'd say about the same for Boros and Amulet Titan. Boros Energy you would think would be very good, and in theory it should be. You get to do the Frog Riddler game plan, which is very good against them. You get to do the Solitude Ephemerate game plan, which is really good against them. You get to do the Atraxa Reanimate game plan, which is really good against them. The thing about Boros is just very, very consistent at doing what they're doing, and sometimes they'll just naturally have the Thraben Charm to blow you out, or sometimes post-sideboard, you'll just get Blood Mooned, and you'll be Blood Mooned out of the game and you can't win. And because of the ways they can just cheese you sometimes, the matchup is actually pretty 50-50, and the games do go very long. So this is a matchup where your Wrath of the Skies are going to come in handy. That mainboard pest control is going to be very useful. And you actually want to keep in all of your force negations to not get cheesed by Blood Moon. This is another matchup where the Marches of Otherworldly Light are very useful at dealing with Blood Moon, because now post-sideboard you'll have 2 Marches and 2 Prismatic Endings. You just want to make sure that at any given time, especially when you're ahead, you play the game in such a way where you can avoid losing to certain cheese out of your deck. Avoid losing to them top decking a Flage and killing you for the last 3 points of damage. Avoid losing them top decking a Goblin Bombardment and sacking their whole board to shoot you. Avoid them top decking a Blood Moon and that blowing you out. Making sure that once you're in a comfortable position, you start fetching your basics. You gain a little bit of life back. If you kill them quickly, just make sure you can manage the ways where you won't die. And then Amulet Titan is super fun, also very 50-50 matchup. Game 1, and even post-sideboard, they just can't interact with your graveyard plan at all. You should be sideboarding out none of your graveyard plan, none of your reanimation plan against Amulet Titan. They're very bad at interacting with you, and you could take advantage of that because you are at least reasonable at interacting with them. You just need to make sure that your hand has both a game plan, a proactive game plan, and maybe 1 or 2 pieces of interaction. So you just need to be particular with the hands you're mulliganing to this matchup, right? Your hand needs a game plan. Also, because sometimes Amulet will mulligan a little bit, especially in these post-sideboard games, you can take advantage of that. Sometimes they only have one big threat after they do their ramp strategy, and you can counter or deal with it in some way, shape, or form. And because of the way I like to board against this matchup, I like to restrict their mana to prevent them to getting to that late game engine with things like Wrath and March that can deal with stuff like Urza Saga or Amulet of Vigors. You want to make sure you still have ways to deal with their alternate threat package, stuff like Elvish Reclaimer, Six, Tireless Tracker, Ice Till Explorer. You need to have ways to manage those types of threats. And then Force of Negation is going to be very clutch later in the game for countering Green Sun Zeniths or Scape Shifts or even Spelunking. A couple other matchups we'll talk about quickly. Is it Prowess? Is it Affinity? Prowess, super favorable matchup, probably the best matchup, the dream matchup that you want to play against with Goryos. Your entire game plan lines up super well against them, except unlike Boros has a lot more problematic interaction for you. Izzet doesn't have any of that. In exchange, they have more speed, but you have these 4 free Solitudes and these 1 mana Marches and Prismos, and you just have good ways to deal with all their threats. You have threats that have lifelink. You can make large things into play very quick that can profitably block their creatures, and it's very hard for them to get any traction going against you. Even post-sideboard, when they have a little more interaction, open deck list is huge, so you know what you have to play around and what you don't. Your sweepers are going to be very powerful here, and all of your creatures line up really well against theirs. There's not too much more to say about this one. If you play the matchup a few times, you'll kind of see what I'm saying. Izzet Affinity, on the flip side, is actually a pretty terrible matchup. It might actually be the worst matchup you can play against, in my experience. This was a matchup where Pest Control really shined in game 1. It's also a matchup that can vary based on what build of Affinity they have. So I would say the faster their build of Affinity is, which usually is a little more stock-ish, the harder it is for Goryos. The more grindy mid-range pieces they have, things like Tamiyo, Emery, or any other alternate threats that aren't trying to kill you as fast as possible, the better it's going to be for you, because it's going to give you more time to catch up, more time to interact, and more time to do your thing. My second to last round in the RC was against a very strong Affinity pilot. I unfortunately had some bad mulligans in the matchup, but I just played really tight. I played as best I could. I played to my outs. I was able to win the second game. I lost the first on a mull to 5. I won the second on a mull to 5. And then in the final game, I just had the Pest Control when I needed it. They had the nuttiest board state on turn 2. Pest Control cleaned up everything but the Urza Saga, and then March was able to deal with the Urza Saga. And it was one of my best wins of the tournament. It was a very challenging matchup, a little bit stressful. I thought it was going to be the end of the line for me, but we were able to push through and get it there. And that was one of the reasons why I was able to qualify for the Pro Tour. And then a deck like Zoo is a deck you always have to respect, specifically the versions with Doorkeeper Thrall. Thrall is a big reason why Grizzlebrand is actually slightly better in that matchup. Post-sideboard, a lot of times I'll take out one Atraxa, keep in the Grizzlebrand. You do that, especially in matchups also where they have a lot of, or against any deck where your opponent has a lot of surgicals, but also against decks where your opponent has good answers to the Atraxa trigger. So Grizzlebrand is really clutch in that matchup. Usually your removal lines up really nicely against their creatures. Quantum Riddler will catch you back up once you pitch all your free spells. And the Atraxa reanimation plan is obviously very good there as well, because they don't have a lot of interaction for you doing the graveyard thing. They can try to stop you with a cheeky Stubborn Denial. They can try to deal with Atraxa once it's in play with a Leyline Binding, but a lot of times you'll be able to get through with that plan. The mirror match is long and grindy. It's not going to come up as much anymore since this deck is falling out of favor, where more people are playing the Jeskai Blink deck, but it's still a pretty good matchup to know how to navigate if you have someone else who plays the deck and you can play against. People usually do one of two different things in the matchup, which is funny because every Goryos player I know approaches it differently. Some people say they want to stay post-sideboard all in on the graveyard plan, because it obviously is very powerful when it works out, when you can Goryos and Atraxa. Personally, and what some other people I know do, is they shave on like half the graveyard package and play this like control-y game plan, try to grind the game out, and then later on like play that fair game plan that I was talking about, where you're just hard casting Riddlers and Solitudes and Atraxas as the game progresses and playing more like a control deck. That's the plan that's worked out for me, but I would recommend actually not even necessarily doing that, but picking the one that you think will work best for you. I like those long games where there's a lot of decisions that can reflect my skill as a player and let me shift the game in my favor and control the game. That's how I like to play the mirror match. But sometimes you might find that your opponent's deck might just be more catered to fulfill that game plan better than yours is. So maybe you should be the one that's doing the aggressive combo plan, and you need to respect that your opponent's going to be better at that mid-range plan than you are. It also could be different based on the player or the draw. There's so many different things to keep in mind when you're deciding that. And then a couple other decks that have picked up a little bit since this tournament. Ruby Storm is a deck that's picked up. You actually don't have a crazy elaborate sideboard plan against this deck because I don't think it's really too bad of a matchup. We actually want to face against decks like Ruby Storm, Neobrand. These sort of fast, more fragile combo decks are usually pretty good for us because we have good answers and good pressure. And then another deck that has been rising in popularity recently is Simic Birthing Ritual, which is actually a bit of a problem deck for Goryos. I played this a bit online and my results were a bit varied, and I tested with this on paper with a friend of mine who's very good with the deck, and she completely smoked me. We played like 4 games and I got blown out. But that kind of taught me a lot about the texture of the matchup. And when I was able to play against this deck in the event, I played it twice, once day 1, once day 2, and I won both times. What I'm going to recommend to you when you're playing against Simic Ritual is to try to skew more towards the plan B Frog Riddler with a fair later game plan and try to grind the game out as long as possible. It's very hard to do the fast thing because they have so much disruption with 4 Solitudes, 4 Flares, usually 2 Force of Negations, a lot of free interaction. It's very hard to get through all of it. And sometimes you will have a good combo hand that goes all in with protection, and that can do it. But I've found that's often not the case, especially post-sideboard when they also have things like Mystical Dispute and just more ways to interact with you, more copies of things like Endurance. These games are going to go long, but if you can profitably interact with their rituals, deal with their Abhorrent Oculuses and their Harbingers, their deck doesn't have as much power as yours does. So you will eventually be able to outvalue them, especially if they're on the non-Rizzler plan, which I don't think my opponents were on Rizzlers in their lists, or at least one of them wasn't. Also, usually the Simic Ritual's only way to deal with your graveyard is with Endurance, which is good for you because you can very aggressively use your spells, such as Solitudes and Ephemerates. In one match post-sideboard, I think the first one I played against, I had used all my Solitudes, and my opponent, and I went for the reanimation plan, and my opponent was forced to Endurance me, which shuffled all my Solitudes back into my deck, and I was able to recycle and reuse them again. And in the second match I played in day 2, post-sideboard, or it might have even been game 1, I had used all my Ephemerates. I had used them very aggressively because I kept drawing them all to loop with Riddler to just draw new cards because I wasn't seeing the cards I needed. But I knew that my opponent inevitably was going to have to Endurance me at some point and shuffle all that material back in if I ever presented the Goryos plan. And that did wind up happening. And once I was able to start reanimating threats, I had more copies of Ephemerate in my deck. So just, you can be a little more liberal in your usage of some of your spells because there's a good chance that a lot of them will get recycled for you if you don't like aggressively exile them with your Psychic Frog or things of that nature. Okay, I do have to end this video now because I have a flight to catch to New York. Hopefully you got some value out of this. If you have other questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. Consider subscribing, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.